What percentage of Target's merchandise is imported into the U.S., and what are some of the main categories that would be affected by this?
Yeah, and I talked about that today. The big categories that we talked about are categories like apparel, where 97% of all the apparel we buy in the U.S. comes from outside the U.S. Electronics, all the devices, all the phones and tablets and TVs, well, those supply chains are in South Korea and Japan and China. So some of those big categories where the only sources of supply are outside the U.S. We do business with lots of great American vendors, some great partners, whether it's Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati or Frito-Lay in Plano, Texas. And we've built some great relationships with new American vendors. But we recognize a lot of the products Americans buy are still coming from overseas.
There is this push though to bring even electronics, even TVs, even iPhones, even apparel back to the U.S., and that this is something that could give companies an edge to bring that back. Do you just not think that's feasible at this point, or it's going to take too much time for it to actually happen?
Yeah, it's one of the things we talked about today, and one of the points I made is there's a lot of ifs. There's a lot of assumptions around currency appreciation, GDP growth, manufacturing coming back, a lot of different variables, but it's hard for me to tell my team, 320,000 Target members, that if all these things happen, things are going to work out. It's hard to tell American families that if currency appreciates and if we see manufacturing return and if we see the GDP growth, everything will be just fine. We need greater certainty. And even with some of the discussion we had today about manufacturing coming back to the U.S., and I'd love to see more of that, it's going to take time. And in many cases, it could take decades and decades. And in some areas, it may never return. So I think we just have to really understand the unintended consequences of this new border adjustability tax.
And last question, I know you would like to see a lower corporate tax rate. If this border adjustment tax went through, what would happen to your corporate tax rate? And is there an alternative tax plan you would like to see that could help, that you feel like would help your business?
So let's start with the facts. For the last decade, we have paid an effective tax rate of 35%, the highest effective tax rate in the country. Under this new plan, that tax rate would go from 35 to 75%. So certainly that's not something that's going to be good for Target. Many of my retail peers have talked about their effective tax rates going from 35 to well over 100. So there's some real concerns. What I'd like to see is greater simplification, and I'd love to see our overall effective tax rate reduced.